Hi, I'm Michael Johnson, and I have a question for you. If you are concerned about how our democracy is working, do you think about how it needs fixing or how we can grow it? If I had to bet, I would say you seldom think about growing it. Here in the time we have together, I want to invite you to consider both important, especially growing it. I am going to argue as well as I can that democracy is in our DNA. But right now, our democracy is a disturbed preteen adolescent. Fixing our current governing process is urgent, but that will not address growing our democracy. We need a new starting point, and I'm going to make the case that the Growing Democracy Project can be that starting point. First, a bit about me and my story. The project and I actually evolved together. At 16, I had a jolting experience I could not understand. At that point in my life, I was completely enthralled with John F. Kennedy as the paradigm of dynamic politics. In spite of this, a message came thundering into my mind as I was watering the family lawn. The world does not work. I had no idea what to do with this, but its impact was so forceful in the moment that I knew I couldn't lose it. So I filed it away somewhere within me, and that folder opened up some 8 years later. Here's what happened. I grew up thoroughly enculturated with Catholicism. I imbibed it to the point of becoming a Benedictine monk in my early 20s. In the midst of a spiritual crisis involving guilt, I began to unpack my Catholicism. This came to a head during a meditation when the core of my crisis lit up like a neon sign. I'm feeling guilty because I'm not feeling guilty. What? Wow, I've been had. Working through this crisis led me to a profound moment where I realized I could be in charge of reshaping my life. I not only left the monastery, but the church as well. I wasn't just grasping an idea. My whole being was recognizing something about myself as a human being that I had never realized before. And I had come to it by working through my spiritual crisis. Overlapping this big change was a series of experiences that began in my senior year of college and later in dropping out of both law school and graduate school. These experiences led me to abandon traditional education as a pathway. Casting about rather desperately for a ground for my life, I grabbed onto the revolutionary fervor of the 60s. Then came an epiphany of sorts during the student insurrection at Columbia University in 1968. It threw my whole conception of politics into doubt. What happened was I realized in a flash, we're trying to dominate them because they're trying to dominate us. This can't work. What is this all about? Now I had a real direction. Eventually, I was able to identify what has become my lifelong research question. When a world works well, what is making it work? This took me into 4 years of community research, outreach work, as well as hundreds of hours in experiential training in psychotherapy, human relations, and group dynamics. Still, answers to my questions were hard to come by. Pursuing them further led me eventually to co-found a transformative intentional community in 1980. I still strive here with 60 others. That's 42 years and counting. Ever since, my everyday living in community has been shaping my research as much as my research has been shaping how I live and relate. The first 20 years involved intense experiential research into the problems of giving and receiving critical feedback. By living the culture that we evolved from this work, I learned three big things. The first one, how to self-determine my life in ways I never imagined. Second, that this process is never ending. And third, to persist on this path, you must be part of a transformative group and culture. Over the past 15 years, I have added a lot of field experience in the cooperative solidarity economic movements, where I learned that for a group to best sustain itself as an effective group, it has to be part of a network of like-minded people. In addition to all of this, I've done much reading and thinking all along the way. In early 2017, all of this experience and reflection began to culminate in what I am calling the Growing Democracy Project. This shows up in its three pillars: culture building, transformative learning, and redefining democracy, primarily as a way of living and relating rather than just a way of governing. So that's me and my background. Now I'd like to get into the project by talking about radically rethinking democracy. Here's a way for us to get started. Imagine a very established and confident 19th century physicist talking about Newtonian physics, how awesome it is and how it explains everything in the physical world. Oh, for sure, there's still a lot of problems out there, but over time we'll get to them. From hindsight, we know our imagined physicist is stuck in Newtonian seeing. For sure, it's a powerful way of seeing the world, the physical world, but just one way. But there was a real late 19th century physicist named Max Planck who wasn't so stuck. He'd been working on one of these challenging problems, bringing all of his Newtonian diligence and expertise to bear on it. However, the problem kept saying, If Planck were here in the 21st century, I'm jumping metaphors here, we could imagine him feeling like he is in a car driving down an unknown road at night. He's having a super hard time navigating because he doesn't realize he is driving by looking in a rear view mirror. At one point, he gets so frustrated, he just shakes. And suddenly, Planck is looking through the front window. Shocked, he sees the solution to his problem. But he also realizes it's in a whole different landscape, one that is more than the Newtonian paradigm. Planck had begun to suspend his way of thinking about physics. And that's what I'm getting at. We need to see and challenge our way of seeing and thinking about democracy. To see and think beyond how we usually do. Our democracy needs you and me, with our heart and mind, to see and sense it in radically fresh ways. And that's what the Growing Democracy Project is all about. So let's look at some of the animating elements of this project. The first thing such a project needs is a worthwhile purpose. And the purpose of this project is idiotically ambitious. To enable everyday people to make democracy the dominant way of governing throughout the United States in all of its various institutions. Yes, everyday people. Second, there is an underlying conviction. The one that hit me back in May of 1968. We and our democracy are dead-ended in an outdated framework, and we don't know how to get out of it. Max Planck, where are you? Third, the Growing Democracy Project has a specific focus. And this is very much about letting go of old ways of seeing. Google takes us through streams and streams of sites and papers about what needs to be done to fix our broken proto-democracy. And this is urgently needed, no question about that. However, it's very difficult to find democracy stuff outside of this fixing box. There are only a few places that focus on figuring out how we can grow democracy. Because this how problem is so important to growing democracy, let's look at two examples that speak to it. The first one, a democracy has to hold politicians and CEOs accountable. That's a what. Monarchic systems are hugely important, but they have always been vulnerable to being undermined and outwitted. Competent and democratically motivated citizens who are well organized for power and spread out across the country are essential for doing this work. But how do we develop legions of people who will want to become democratically competent enough to do this work well? That is, do it compassionately and intelligently. A second example, democratizing our institutions more fully is one of the things we need to do. People right, left, and center are saying this. It's another what? But think about this. Everyday people are everywhere, And they have huge influence in shaping our quasi-democratic institutions and how those shape us. If they become conscious of having this power, then they could become a key, if not the key factor, in growing democracy. But how can they learn to democratize themselves into people full of loving, proactive power? Okay, so we have a purpose, a conviction, and a focus on this vastly overlooked matter of how. But that focus on how takes us up to a great big wall: lack of know-how. We really don't know how to grow democracy so that everyday people can make governing of, by, and for the people a reality at all levels of society. In fact, when we think about democracy, we hardly ever think in terms of how to grow it. Our passions rightfully roar around the right to vote. That's absolutely essential. But not about how to develop personal responsibility for democratic empowerment throughout our populace. So, with the Growing Democracy Project, we have four catalyzing elements: a purpose, a conviction, a focus, and ignorance, lack of know-how. Knowing what we don't know is a critical resource. Together, these four elements can form a starting point. And here's how I think we can learn how to do this work. First, the three pillars I mentioned earlier: culture building, transformative learning, and redefining democracy primarily as a way of living and relating rather than just as a way of governing. Second, through a structural plan to build a national project on these pillars. We will get to the plan later. Right now, let's go deeper into what's involved in redefining democracy. This will overlap with why culture building is so important. And that will take us into transformative learning, which in turn will take us directly into the structure part. Our predominant notion of democracy is that it is a way of governing. But the Growing Democracy Project, this is beginning the story in the middle. It makes no sense. Democracy starts and ends with our living and relating to each other, grounded in hearing and understanding, so we can think and act together. Our rainforests, like the Amazon, are the lungs of our earth. Hearing and understanding each other are the lungs of every functional group. This is what we do when we make a family, when musicians make music, when a work team gets a job done, when a Ukraine defends itself. This is why democracy can be an effective way of governing at all levels of society. It's in our DNA. Okay, this is really important. A cognitive understanding of our democracy is essential. but it won't do the job of making a democracy work well. Democracy must be lived, and we are its lungs. Cooperation and democracy are in every cell of our bodies, but so are selfishness and domination. There's a big mistake going down, and so many of us aren't seeing it. We're trying to figure out how to liberate our democracy for some 10,000 years of patriarchy, and at the same time adapt it to the huge, complex scale of life today without focusing on how we can enable everyday people to be a vitally active part of the process. I'm arguing that when we have a significant number of citizens practicing and developing democracy as a way of living and relating, even loving, we will be able to see our way to a solidly democratic way of governing, but not before. Now, if we step back a bit, we will see that our breathing metaphor falls short. And seeing how it falls short will show us how essential self-transformation is to growing democracy. Our bodies and our rainforests breathe automatically. Breathing relationally, however, has to be developed and sustained through struggle and with others. The basic requirement for its success is obviously twofold: inhaling and exhaling information, feelings, thoughts, ideas, experiences. Inhaling, wanting to hear and understand each other so we can think and act together. Exhaling, willing to move into our vulnerabilities by speaking our relevant responses to what we are taking in, whatever they may be. Speaking truth to one another, face to face, as well as we can, and learning how to do it better. Then wanting to hear back the response to what we put out. Back to inhaling, exhaling, inhaling. Please note, I did not say we should hear and understand each other, nor let's be transparent. It's about wanting to hear and understand each other, as well as willing to move into our vulnerabilities by speaking our hard truth to each other. Motivation is at the core of this kind of breathing. It sustains and develops the practice, and the practice sustains and develops trust. And trust is absolutely essential. These are the roots of democracy. And we are all in deep conflict about this stuff in every part of our lives. In our bedrooms, our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our school boards, everywhere we live and relate. It's a persistent struggle. It is the overarching conflict of human life. Selfishness and domination pitted against cooperation and democracy. Each of us embodies and transmits this conflict. Here's the good news. The transformative capacity to shift the balance of this struggle, personally and collectively, is in our DNA. However, our motivation and competence for doing it must be learned, developed, and persistently nurtured. That's the role of culture. It is not the role of ideology. Our fears, biases, ignorance, certitude, hatred, selfishness, and domination are our primary challenges, and they will not go away. Developing and nurturing this root democracy is our starting point. We have to go beyond just doing democracy. And that brings us to another pillar of the project, transformative learning, which is, briefly, an emerging experiential learning tradition based on the insight that it's the learner's interpretation of her experience that creates meaning for her, and that thinking through these interpretations with others can lead to deep changes, not only in her, but also in their behavior, mindset, and experience. Its potential is huge, and that potential is hugely untapped. And this presents a major how challenge. How can we take this kind of learning to scale? Doing this would require an ongoing learning system, serious research and development, and the institutional wherewithal to support, promote, and organize for these kinds of changes. That's a lot of work, and it will take a long, long time. That's why the growing democracy sees itself as a starting point and not a solution. These kinds of changes will not come about by political reforms to our governing processes, no matter how important those are. We need to engage legions of everyday people in transformation and rethinking democracy from the ground up. Achieving this would produce a major cultural transition. And to do this, we need a vehicle. And that brings us to the structural elements of the project. What follows is more of a sketch of the essential structural elements than a blueprint. Implementing this project will involve working with a lot that is already up and running, and that will shape what gets put into place. But there are three essential pieces. For starters, there needs to be a basic unit that is peer-driven, the Transformative Community of Democratic Practice, or TC for short. The name captures its purpose. They would be small learning and action groups of 10 to 20 people who are grounded locally in a specific community, neighborhood, workplace, organization, housing unit, etc. But standalone TCs will have very little chance to sustain themselves over time or develop small dynamic cultures. Evolutionary thinking tells us that the power of selfishness is too great in the isolated small group context. This calls for a growing democracy network of many centers to connect and integrate all of the TCs. This network would have three roles to play. First, provide ongoing mutual support, training, and multi-group bonding for the TCs. The second one, serve as a participatory action research project for continuous development of the practices and theory for transformative learning and culture building. And third, house a participatory management coordinating system. And that brings us to the last but not least, culture building, the dynamo of the Growing Democracy Project, because culture is the driving force of the human species. Our whole spectrum of diverse ideologies is a product of our cultural diversity. No one ideology can see or hear well enough to be in charge. We need all of them at the table, listening, arguing, and understanding each other. Some several 100,000 years ago, some primates crossed an evolutionary Rubicon. They began sharing intentions with each other, and that led to thinking together so they could act together better, as in hunting, farming, community building, child rearing. It's referred to as the fourth great evolutionary transition, and it's the latest one. This breakthrough led to a still evolving capacity to cooperate that has driven human development ever since. Through culture, we have become able to work together better and more powerfully than any other species. The outcome of all of this development, however, is not utopian at all. On the one hand, yes, it was the beginning of democracy. Equals could now join together to offset the domination of alpha males and females. Further, the scope of our imagining, innovating, and wealth building has gone beyond anything we could have imagined just a few centuries ago. But on the other hand, this holds true for our collective capacity for violence and domination. That continues to capture much of our cooperative power for selfish ends and empire building, taking us now to the precipice of massive self-destruction. As I noted, this is the overarching conflict of our species: selfishness and domination pitted against cooperation and democracy. If culture is such a powerhouse, we need to understand how it works and how we can consciously use it to make cooperation and democracy the dominant forces in our lives. And that's pretty much the project as a starting point for growing democracy. To summarize, we can say that the Growing Democracy Project plans to use transformative processes in the basic unit of culture, the small group, and join them together in a transformative group of groups for continuous learning of how to grow democracy through personal development, meaningful relationship, and organizing for power. The thrust of this project is about people taking responsibility for their lives, connecting with others, developing love and trust, and becoming competent in democratic practices. In a word, everyday people coming together to share their energy and passion and struggles as a gift for themselves and to each other in order to make their worlds work better. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to your responses.